The storm came down like the hand of God. Thomas Brennan gripped the steering wheel of his battered Ford pickup, the wipers beating a losing battle against the snow that hammered the windshield in sheets of white fury. 37 years he'd driven these Montana back roads, and he'd never seen a December storm hit this hard this fast. The temperature gauge on the dashboard read -15, but the wind made it feel like the air itself wanted to tear the skin from his bones. He should have stayed home. The thought came too late, the way most of his better judgments seem to arrive these days. The trip into town had been necessary, or so he told himself. Supplies, propane, things a man needed to get through a Montana winter alone. But the truth sat heavier in his chest than any grocery bag. He'd needed to get out of that cabin, away from the silence that pressed against his eardrums like deep water, away from the empty chair at the kitchen table and the coffee mug he still couldn't bring himself to put away. 3 years. 3 years since Margaret had taken her last breath in the bedroom they'd shared for 34 years, her hand cooling in his, while the hospice nurse stood quietly in the corner. 3 years since the world had stopped making sense. The truck's headlights caught nothing but swirling white. Tom leaned forward, squinting through the assault of snow, searching for the faint yellow line that marked the center of County Road 12. The road that would take him back to the cabin, back to the woods, back to the place where he could at least pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. Something dark flashed across the beam of light. Tom's foot hit the brake instinctively, the truck sliding sideways before the tires caught on a patch of bare asphalt and jerked to a stop. His heart hammered against his ribs, the old combat reflexes flooding his system with adrenaline he didn't want and couldn't control. He sat there for a moment, breathing hard, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Nothing moved ahead, just snow, just the endless white. Tom shifted into park, leaving the engine running and the heater blasting. He opened the door and stepped out into the teeth of the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind screamed through the pine trees that lined the road, carrying snow horizontally across the open ground. Tom pulled his collar up and moved forward, boots crunching through the accumulation that was already 6 inches deep and climbing. He almost missed it. Dark fur against white snow, barely visible in the dancing light from the truck's headlights. A shape that didn't belong. Tom moved closer, his breath coming in short white bursts. A dog. No, not just a dog. The animal lay on its side in the ditch, half buried in the drift that had formed against the guardrail. Large, maybe 80-90 pounds. German Shepherd from what Tom could see through the snow caked to its fur. The kind of dog you saw working alongside soldiers in documentaries. The kind Tom had seen plenty of times before in places where men spoke in whispers and walked with weapons ready. Blood stained the snow beneath the animal's hind leg. Dark, fresh enough that it hadn't frozen yet. Tom crouched down, his knees protesting the movement. 62 years old, and his body remembered every hard landing, every forced march, every firefight that had ended with him on the ground. He reached out slowly, his hand stopping just short of the dog's head. The animal's eyes were closed. Its ribs barely moved with each shallow breath. "Easy, boy," Tom said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "I'm not here to hurt you." He placed his hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling for the ring and fall of breath. There, faint, but there. The dog's eyes flickered open just for a second. Dark brown, almost black, with a depth that reminded Tom of men he'd known. Men who'd seen too much and carried it alone. The eyes closed again. Tom stood, his mind already moving through the logistics. The dog was too heavy to carry far, and the blizzard wasn't letting up. He had maybe 20 minutes before the road became impassable even for his four-wheel drive. Less before the cold finished what the injury had started. He moved back to the truck and pulled out the heavy canvas tarp he kept in the bed for hauling firewood. The wind tried to rip it from his hands as he carried it back to the ditch. Carefully moving with the kind of deliberate calm he'd learned in 100 bad situations, Tom worked the tarp under the dog's body. The animal whimpered once, a sound so quiet and defeated it cut through Tom's chest like shrapnel. "I know," Tom said, his hand steady even as his heart kicked against his ribs. "I know it hurts, But you're going to have to trust me here. He lifted. 90 pounds of unconscious oil and wet tarp in his lower back screamed in protest. Tom ignored it, ignored the wind, ignored everything except the 10 feet between the ditch and the truck's passenger door. He made it in 6 steps, breathing hard, and managed to angle the dog onto the bench seat without dropping him. The animal's head lolled to one side. Blood dripped onto the old upholstery. Tom grabbed an emergency blanket from behind the seat and spread it over the dog's body, tucking it around the visible wounds. Then he shut the door, climbed back into the driver's seat, and put the truck in gear. The cabin was 12 miles away. He drove in silence, both hands on the wheel, the only sound the labored breathing from the passenger seat and the endless assault of snow against metal and glass. The dog didn't move. Tom Brennan had carried wounded men out of kill zones, had held pressure on arterial bleeds while waiting for medevac, had watched good soldiers die in his arms because help came 5 minutes too late. He knew the sound of a body giving up, the way breath turned shallow and irregular right before the end. This dog was circling that edge. "Stay with me," Tom said quietly, his eyes fixed on the road. "Just stay with me a little longer." The dog's ear twitched, just barely, but it was something. Tom pressed the accelerator a fraction harder. The cabin appeared out of the white like a ghost materializing from fog. Small, weathered. The porch light he'd left on struggling against the darkness and snow. Home for what the word was worth these days. Tom killed the engine and moved fast. Around to the passenger side door, opened the dog's weight in his arms again. Up the 3 steps to the porch, snow already drifting across the boards. Through the front door and into the living room, where the wood stove still held enough heat to push back the cold. He laid the dog on the old quilt in front of the stove, the one Margaret had made from his old uniform shirts after he'd retired. The irony wasn't lost on him. For the first time with decent light, Tom could see the extent of the damage. Gunshot wound. High on the right hind leg, the entry point clean, but the exit ragged. Old enough that the bleeding had mostly stopped, but recent enough that infection would be racing through the animal system. Deep lacerations across the shoulders and rib cage, like something with claws had tried to tear the dog apart. Burns on the front paws, the pads cracked and blackened. This wasn't a stray that had gotten hit by a car. This was a dog that had been through a war. Tom's hands moved automatically, falling into the rhythm of field medicine he'd learned 30 years ago and never quite forgotten. Clean towels from the linen closet, hydrogen peroxide from under the bathroom sink, gauze, medical tape, a bottle of antibiotics left over from when he'd gotten pneumonia last winter. He worked carefully, cleaning each wound, his hands steady, even as his mind cataloged the damage. Ranger's eyes had shut again. Each breath came shallow and labored, chest rising just enough to show life still flickered inside. The dog's heart beat strong beneath Tom's palm when he checked. This animal had been a fighter, was still fighting. Tom wrapped the worst of the wounds, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, studying the dog in the firelight. German Shepherd, male, maybe 5-6 years old. The kind of physical conditioning you didn't get from running around a backyard. Scars crisscrossed the animal's body beneath the fur, old injuries that had healed tough. Military working dog Tom would bet his pension on it. The bearing was there, even unconscious. The discipline bred into muscle memory. A collar hung loose around the dog's neck, half hidden in the thick fur. Tom reached for it, his fingers finding the metal tag that hung from the leather. He lifted it into the light. MWD, Ranger Handler, CPL Wade Hutchins, KI, a June 2024. Tom's breath caught in his chest. The date stamped on the tag was 6 months ago, June. The height of summer, when Montana burned hot and dry and the mountains shimmered in the heat. This dog's handler had died 6 months ago, and somehow the animal had survived alone ever since. But that wasn't what made Tom's hands go still. KIA, killed in action. This wasn't a pet that had lost its owner to old age or illness. This was a soldier's dog, a handler and partner who died in the line of duty somewhere far from home doing a job that most people would never understand and fewer would ever know about. Tom looked down at the unconscious animal, seeing it differently now. Not just a dog, a veteran, a survivor of something terrible carrying wounds both visible and buried deep. Ranger, Tom said quietly, testing the name. That's what they called you. The dog's ear twitched again at the sound of its name. Tom pulled a blanket from the back of the couch and spread it over Ranger's body, tucking it carefully around the bandaged wounds. Then he stood his knees cracking in protest and walked to the kitchen. The clock on the wall read 10:47. He filled a bowl with water and set it on the floor near Ranger's head. Did the same with kibble from the bag he kept for the occasional raccoon that wandered too close to the porch. Then he settled into the worn armchair 6 feet away, the shotgun he grabbed from the gun cabinet resting across his lap. Not because he thought the dog would turn aggressive. Because a dog that had been through what Ranger had been through might wake up fighting, might not recognize friend from threat in those first confused seconds. And Tom had seen too many good men hurt by startled animals to take chances. So he sat, and he waited. The fire crackled in the stove. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, rattling the windows in their frames. Snow piled against the glass, cutting off the view of the forest beyond. Tom didn't move. This was familiar territory. Watching, waiting, keeping vigil over someone who might not make it through the night. He'd done it in desert outposts, in jungle clearings, in field hospitals, in medevac helicopters. Had sat beside dying men and whispered promises he couldn't keep because sometimes a lie was kinder than silence. But this was different. This was his home, his choice. His responsibility accepted the moment he had lifted that dog from the frozen ditch. Ranger's breathing evened out as the hours passed, the ragged quality fading into something steadier. Around midnight, the dog's eyes opened halfway, unfocused, confused. The animal tried to lift its head, failed, and let it drop back to the quilt with a soft whine. Easy, Tom said quietly, not moving from the chair. You're safe, you're inside. Nobody's going to hurt you here. Ranger's eyes tracked to the sound of his voice, dark and deep and impossibly aware, even through the haze of pain and exhaustion. They stared at each other across the dim room. Tom saw recognition flicker in those eyes, not of him specifically, but of the tone, the calm authority of a handler's voice speaking in the cadence that meant safety. That meant mission complete. That meant stand down. Ranger's eyes closed again, but the dog's breathing stayed steady. Tom allowed himself a small measure of relief. Not much, not yet, but enough to loosen the grip on the shotgun and let his shoulders drop an inch. The dog would make it through the night. What came after he'd figure out in the morning. The blizzard blew itself out sometime before dawn. Tom woke to silence his neck, protesting the angle he'd fallen asleep at in the chair. Gray light filtered through the frost-covered windows, painting everything in shades of white and shadow. Ranger was awake. The dog lay exactly where Tom had left him, head raised slightly, watching. No aggression in the posture, no fear, just awareness, the kind of patient observation that came from years of training and discipline. Morning, Tom said quietly, not moving yet. How are you feeling? Ranger's tail moved once against the floor, a weak thump, barely audible but deliberate. Tom stood slowly, setting the shotgun aside but keeping his movements careful and visible. He walked to the kitchen, filled a mug with yesterday's coffee, and reheated it on the stove. Then he refreshed the water bowl and brought it closer to Ranger. The dog's nose twitched at the scent of water. Its tongue came out dry and cracked, and Tom helped angle the bowl so Ranger could drink without having to lift its head too far. The animal drank slowly, deeply. When it was done, those dark eyes fixed on Tom again. You've got questions, Tom said, settling back into the chair with his coffee. I get it. Where are you? Who am I? What happens next? He took a sip, the bitter heat cutting through the exhaustion that sat heavy in his bones. I don't have all the answers. But here's what I can tell you. My name's Tom. This is my place. You're hurt bad, but you're going to live if you let yourself heal. and nobody's going to touch you while you're here. Ranger's ears twitched forward at the sound of his voice, processing the words and tone, with the focus of an animal trained to listen, to understand, to respond. I know you're military, Tom continued, his voice low and steady. I saw your tag. I'm sorry about your handler. That's a hard loss to carry. The dog's eyes never left his face. Tom wondered what Ranger saw when he looked at him. An old man, probably, worn down and worn out, living alone in a cabin that was too quiet and too full of ghosts. Someone who'd stopped being a soldier decades ago and never quite figured out what to be instead. But maybe the dog saw something else too. Maybe Ranger recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to survive when you'd watched your partner fall, to keep breathing when the only person who'd truly known you was gone. Tom raised his mug in a small salute. Welcome home, Ranger. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Tom had forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose that extended beyond basic survival. To wake up with a reason to get out of bed beyond the simple biological necessity of staying alive. Ranger changed that in ways both small and profound. The dog healed slowly, too slowly if Tom was being honest. The gunshot wound showed signs of infection despite the antibiotics, and Ranger's appetite remained weak. But there was progress, small victories measured in inches rather than miles. The way Ranger's breathing strengthened, the alertness that returned to those dark eyes. The first time the dog managed to lift its head without help, then hold it there for a full minute before exhaustion dragged it back down. His fingers worked with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from decades of treating combat wounds guiding each movement as he cleaned and rebandaged the wounds twice a day. Ranger never growled, never snapped, never showed any aggression, despite what had to be considerable pain. The dog simply endured with the kind of stoic patience Tom recognized from men who'd learned that complaining changed nothing. On the second day, Ranger ate. Not much. A few pieces of kibble softened in warm water. But the dog chewed and swallowed and kept it down, and Tom felt something in his chest unclench. On the third day, Tom sat on the floor beside Ranger and told him about Margaret. He didn't know why. The words just came spilling out into the quiet cabin like water from a cracked dam. How they'd met at a VA hospital dance in 1989. Tom, fresh back from a deployment he still couldn't talk about. And Margaret volunteering as a candy striper because her father had been a Marine. How she'd asked him to dance and he'd said yes, even though he'd had 2 left feet and no business being in a room full of people. How she'd laughed when he stepped on her toes and the sound had cracked something open inside him that he didn't know had been sealed shut. 34 years of marriage. Through deployments and homecomings, through the nightmares that woke him screaming and the days when he couldn't get out of bed. Through his retirement and her illness, the cancer that came quietly and left devastation in its wake. I was in Germany when she called to tell me about the diagnosis. Tom said, his voice rough around the edges. Training exercise. Routine. I told her I'd be home in 2 weeks. He paused, his hand resting on Ranger's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath. By the time I got back, the doctors said she had maybe 4 months. We got 2. Ranger's eyes were fixed on his face, unblinking. I should have been here, Tom continued. Should have noticed something was wrong before I left. Should have said no to the deployment. Should have... He trailed off the words tangling in his throat. Should have. Could have. The refrain of every soldier who'd ever lost someone while they were gone. I sat with her every day those last 2 months, Tom said quietly. Held her hand, read to her, told her stories about the places we were going to go when she got better, even though we both knew she wasn't getting better. And when she died, it was peaceful, quiet, like she'd just decided it was time to go and there was nothing I could do to convince her to stay. He sat in the silence that followed, his hand still on Ranger's warm fur, and felt the weight of 3 years of grief pressing against his chest. The cabin was supposed to be our retirement, he said finally. We bought it together, planned to fix it up, spend our mornings drinking coffee on the porch and our evenings watching the sun go down over the mountains. But then she got sick and we never got the chance. So now it's just me, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. Ranger shifted slightly, a small movement that brought the dog's head closer to Tom's leg. I'm not telling you this because I want pity, Tom said, his voice steadier now. I'm telling you because I think maybe you understand. You lost someone too, someone important. And you've been carrying that alone for 6 months, just like I've been carrying mine for 3 years. So maybe we can carry it together for a while, just until you're strong enough to move on. The dog's tail moved. Once, twice. A slow, deliberate wag that said more than words ever could. Tom sat there on the floor beside Ranger as the afternoon light faded to evening, his hand on the dog's side, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of it. The knock on the door came on the fourth day, just after noon. Tom looked up from the book he had been reading aloud to Ranger, an old Western that Margaret had loved. The dog's ears had already swiveled toward the sound body, tensing despite the injuries. Easy, Tom said quietly, his hand on Ranger's shoulder. Probably just Sarah. He stood his joints protesting and walked to the door. Through the frosted window, he could see the familiar outline of his neighbor's arms, laden with what looked like a casserole dish. Tom opened the door to a blast of cold air and Sarah Hartley's warm smile. Don't you dare tell me you're not hungry, she said, pushing past him into the cabin, with the kind of friendly authority that came from 20 years of showing up uninvited and being welcomed anyway. I made too much lasagna and I refused to eat it all myself. Sarah was 55, though she'd probably punch anyone who mentioned it. Compact and efficient with steel gray hair. She kept short and practical, and eyes that missed nothing. She'd moved into the cabin 3 miles down the road 6 years ago after her husband Robert had died in a training accident at Fort Carson. Tom had known Rob, had served with him in Iraq back in 2006, had been at the funeral when they'd buried him with full military honors, and had quietly kept an eye on Sarah in the years since the way you did for the widow of a brother in arms. She'd returned the favor in her own way, showing up every few weeks with food or firewood or just conversation, whether Tom wanted it or not. You could have called, Tom said, closing the door behind her. I did. You didn't answer. Sarah moved toward the kitchen, then stopped mid-step as her eyes landed on Ranger. Well, you've been busy. Found him in the ditch during the storm, Tom said, watching her carefully. Sarah had a gift for reading situations, and he could see her cataloging details. The bandages, the military tag, the way Ranger watched her without moving, alert but not aggressive. Military working dog, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. His handler died 6 months ago. Sarah set the casserole dish on the counter and crossed the room slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She stopped 6 feet from Ranger and crouched down, not reaching out, just making herself smaller and less imposing. Hey there, soldier, she said softly. You've had a rough time, haven't you? Ranger's tail moved once against the floor. Sarah looked up at Tom, and he saw understanding in her eyes. She knew what it was like to lose someone in service, knew the weight of a folded flag and a knock on the door that changed everything, knew that sometimes the hardest part of survival was figuring out what to do with the life you had left. He's welcome to stay as long as he needs, she said, standing up. And so are you, Tom. Whatever you need, you know where to find me. Tom nodded, not trusting his voice to answer. Sarah moved back to the kitchen, pulled plates from the cabinet with the ease of someone who knew where everything was kept, and started serving lasagna like this was her house and Tom was the guest. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that only comes from years of knowing someone well enough that words are not always necessary. Sarah asked about Ranger's injuries, and Tom gave her the clinical rundown. She asked if he'd contacted anyone about the dog, and Tom admitted he hadn't. You should call the base, she said gently. They might be looking for him. I know. Tom pushed his lasagna around his plate. I will. Just wanted to make sure he was stable first. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. Tom didn't want to make the call, didn't want to hand Ranger over to some bureaucracy that would process him like equipment, decide he was too damaged for service, and put him down because retired military working dogs were expensive to maintain and hard to adopt out. Sarah didn't push. She just nodded and changed the subject, talking about the storm damage, the road conditions, the way winter was settling in early this year. When she left an hour later, she paused at the door. Rob would have liked him, she said, glancing back at Ranger. He always said the dogs had more sense than half the officers. Tom smiled despite himself. Rob said that about everyone. True. Sarah pulled her coat tighter against the cold. Take care of yourself, Tom, and take care of him. I think maybe you need each other right now. She was gone before he could answer her truck, disappearing down the snow-covered road. Tom closed the door and turned to find Ranger watching him. What do you think? Tom asked the dog. Should I call the base? Ranger's tail remained still. Yeah, Tom said quietly. That's what I thought. He didn't make the call. The road into town was clear for the first time in 5 days, and Tom needed supplies. Dog food for one thing. Ranger was eating more consistently now, and the bag of kibble Tom kept for wildlife wasn't going to last much longer. Plus antibiotics from the farm supply store, since the human variety he had been using probably wasn't ideal for a 90-pound German Shepherd. He left Ranger sleeping by the fire, the dogs breathing steady and strong, and made the 20-minute drive to Whitefish. The town hadn't changed much in the 3 years since Margaret died. Same gas station on the corner of Highway 93. Same handful of shops clustered around Main Street. Same faces behind the counters, most of whom had stopped trying to make conversation with Tom after the funeral. He filled up at the CNX station on the south edge of town, the wind cutting across the open lot and carrying the smell of diesel and old snow. The pump clicked slowly, numbers rolling over on the display, while Tom stood with his hands shoved in his pockets and his collar turned up against the cold. That's when the motorcycles pulled in. 5 of them, loud enough to rattle windows' chrome gleaming even under the overcast sky. They rolled up to the far side of the lot and killed their engines one by one. The sudden silence almost as jarring as the noise had been. Tom didn't look over, didn't need to. He'd seen enough road crews in his life to recognize the type. Hard men with harder attitudes looking for trouble because anything else felt like weakness. The pump clicked off. Tom replaced the nozzle and headed inside to pay, keeping his movements casual and unhurried. The inside of the gas station smelled like burnt coffee and cleaning chemicals. Tom pulled out his wallet at the counter, waiting while the clerk rang up the fuel. The door chimed behind him. Heavy boots on linoleum. The smell of leather and motor oil and beer that hadn't quite worn off from last night. Tom didn't turn around. Hey, old man. The voice came from directly behind him. Young, male, carrying the kind of casual cruelty that usually meant nothing good was coming. Tom handed his card to the clerk and waited for the machine to process. I'm talking to you. A hand landed on Tom's shoulder. Not hard, but not friendly either. The kind of touch meant to assert dominance, to make someone turn around and acknowledge the person in charge. Tom went very still. The clerk's eyes went wide. She knew him, had known. Margaret had probably heard the stories about what Tom used to do before he retired to Montana to grow old in peace. I think he might be deaf, another voice said from somewhere near the door. Laughter followed, mean-spirited and sharp. Tom took his card back from the clerk and slipped it into his wallet. Then slowly he turned around. 5 of them, just like he'd counted from the bikes. Ages ranging from early 20s to mid-40s, all wearing the same basic uniform of leather and denim and too much attitude. The one who'd touched his shoulder stood closest, a tall man with a snake tattooed up the side of his neck and eyes that had seen their share of violence. Can I help you, gentlemen? Tom asked quietly, his voice level and calm. Snake Tattoo grinned. Maybe. See, my boys and I were just discussing how some people don't know their place anymore. Old guys thinking they can just ignore their betters, thinking they're too good to show respect. Tom said nothing. His hands hung loose at his sides, his weight balanced evenly on both feet. Old habits, muscle memory, from a lifetime of knowing that sometimes the only way out of a bad situation was through it. What's the matter? Snake Tattoo leaned closer. Cat got your tongue, Grandpa. I don't want any trouble, Tom said quietly. Just paid for my gas. I'll be on my way. See, that's what I'm talking about. Snake Tattoo looked back at his friends playing to the crowd. No respect. Didn't even answer my question. Tom held his ground. Didn't hear a question. Heard some commentary. If there's something specific you need, I'm listening. The grin faded from Snake Tattoo's face. For a second, Tom saw the calculus happening behind those eyes. The recognition that maybe this wasn't going to go the way he'd expected. That maybe the old man in the worn coat wasn't quite the easy target he'd appeared to be. Then Snake Tattoo's expression hardened. Specific? He stepped closer, invading Tom's space with deliberate aggression. How about this? I think you should apologize for disrespecting me and my crew right here, right now. Tom studied the younger man's face, saw the desperation underneath the bravado, the need to prove something to someone for reasons that probably went deeper than this moment. I haven't disrespected anyone, Tom said calmly. Haven't said a word to you or your friends. But if my presence here is causing a problem, I apologize for that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home. He started to turn toward the door. Snake Tattoo grabbed his arm. Tom's training barrier kicked in automatically, not thought just reflex. His hand came up, caught the wrist, rotated it outward while his body turned, and suddenly Snake Tattoo was off balance and bent forward at an angle that it made his shoulder joints scream in protest. It happened in less than a second. Tom held the position for a heartbeat just long enough to make the point, then released and stepped back with his hands raised, palms out. Don't touch me again, he said quietly. The gas station went silent. Snake Tattoo straightened his face, flushed with anger and humiliation. His friends had gone very still, the casual mockery replaced with something harder and more dangerous. You just made a big mistake, old man. Snake Tattoo said, his voice low and tight. That's when his eyes caught the name stitched on Tom's old work jacket, the one he'd worn during his years as a contractor after leaving active duty, the one that still had his last name embroidered on the breast pocket. Brennan. Tom saw the recognition hit, saw Snake Tattoo's expression shift from anger to something else, something that looked almost like fear. Wait, Snake Tattoo's voice changed. Brennan, Tom Brennan. Tom said nothing. You're Tom Brennan, the one who testified against my father. And just like that, Tom understood. The face clicked into place. Not the man in front of him, but the echo of someone else. Older, meaner, wearing a sheriff's uniform instead of leather and denim, but with the same cruel eyes. Sheriff Marcus Vance. 25 years ago, a case that had torn Whitefish apart. Evidence of corruption so deep it reached from the county lockup to the state capitol. Tom had been called to testify because he had witnessed one of Vance's deputies plant evidence on a veteran, a good man who had come home from Desert Storm with PTSD and gotten targeted for speaking out against police brutality. Tom's testimony had put Marcus Vance in prison, where he died 3 years into a 15-year sentence, stabbed in the prison yard by an inmate whose family he'd brutalized during his years as sheriff. The man in front of him was Derek Vance, Marcus's son, who'd been 20 years old when his father went to prison and who'd clearly spent the last 25 years nurturing a hatred that had nowhere else to go. Yeah, Derek said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. I know exactly who you are. You're the son of a bitch who destroyed my family, who sent my father to die in prison for doing his job. Your father wasn't doing his job, Tom said quietly. He was hurting people, innocent people, and someone needed to stop him. Derek's hand moved to his belt, where Tom could see the outline of something metal tucked beneath his jacket. Gentlemen, the clerk said, her voice high and frightened. Please, I don't want any trouble in here. Derek didn't look away from Tom. This isn't trouble, not yet, but it's coming. He leaned closer, his breath hot and sour. I've waited 25 years, Brennan. 25 years watching you live, quiet and comfortable in that cabin, while my father rotted in the ground. You think you're safe out there in the woods. You think I don't know where you live. Tom met his eyes steadily. Think you should walk away while you still can." Derek laughed sharp and ugly. "What, you going to testify against me too? Send me to prison like you did my old man?" He straightened his hands still on whatever was tucked in his belt. "Tomorrow night, Brennan, I'm coming for you, and this time, there won't be any courtroom to hide behind." He turned and walked out, his crew following without a word. Tom stood alone in this gas station, his heart pounding and his hands absolutely steady, and watched through the window as the motorcycles roared to life and disappeared down the highway. The clerk's voice was shaking when she spoke. "Mr. Brennan, you should call the sheriff." "Yeah," Tom said quietly. "I probably should." But he didn't. He bought the dog food and antibiotics, loaded them into the truck, and drove home in silence, his mind already running through scenarios and probabilities and defensive positions. Ranger was awake when Tom came through the door, the dog's head lifting at the sound of footsteps. Those dark eyes tracked Tom across the room with the kind of focused awareness that said the animal knew something was wrong. Tom set the supplies on the counter and stood there for a moment, his hands braced against the edge, his head bowed. 25 years. He'd thought that chapter of his life was closed, had testified, watched Marcus Vance get sentenced, and then moved on. Built a life with Margaret. Retired. Tried to become something other than a soldier who'd spent too many years solving problems with violence. But the past had a way of coming back. Tom pushed off the counter and walked to the living room window. The forest stretched out in every direction, pine trees heavy with snow, the mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. Peaceful, quiet, the kind of place a man could disappear into and never be found, or the kind of place where you could be trapped with nowhere to run. He turned and looked at Ranger, who was watching him with that patient, knowing expression. "Your handler died 6 months ago," Tom said quietly. "June, summer. That means you survived alone through the heat, through the drought, through everything this country could throw at you. And you made it all the way here, to this cabin, to me." Ranger's ears twitched forward. "I don't think that was an accident," Tom continued. He moved to the mantel above the fireplace where Margaret's photo sat in a simple frame, taken on their 20th anniversary, her smile bright and real, her hand in his. "Today's December 19th. 3 years ago today, Margaret died. Right here in this cabin in our bedroom, holding my hand." He picked up the photo, his thumb tracing the edge of the frame. "I should have been with her sooner. Should have come home when she first got sick. Should have said no to the deployment, told them I was done, that my wife needed me more than any training exercise ever would." He set the photo down carefully. "But I didn't. I stayed, did my duty. And by the time I got home, it was too late for anything except watching her die." The cabin was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. "I came here to hide," Tom said. "Told myself I was retiring, building a life. But really I was just running from everyone and everything that reminded me I'd failed when it mattered most." He looked at Ranger. "But I'm done running." The dog stood, slowly, carefully favoring the injured leg, but moving with deliberate purpose. Ranger crossed the room and sat beside Tom, close enough to touch and raise one paw. Tom took it, his hand wrapping around the dog's paw, and felt something break open inside his chest. Not grief this time. Not guilt. Resolve. "Derek Vance wants to come here tomorrow night," Tom said quietly. "Wants to hurt me for what I did to his father. And maybe he's got the right to be angry. Maybe I did destroy his family when I testified. But his father was hurting people, destroying lives, and someone needed to stop him." Ranger's dark eyes never left his face. "This cabin is all I have left of Margaret. The dream we never got to live. The future we planned and never saw. And I'll be damned if I let some angry kid with a grudge burn it down because he can't let go of the past." He released Ranger's paw and moved to the gun cabinet, unlocked it with the key he kept on a chain around his neck. Inside, his service rifle sat where it had for 3 years, cleaned and maintained, but never fired since his retirement. Tom lifted it out, the weight familiar in his hands. "I don't want to fight," he said, checking the action and finding it smooth. "Don't want to hurt anyone. But if they come here, if they threaten what's mine, I'll do what needs to be done." He looked at Ranger. "You don't have to be part of this. You've already given enough. Already lost your partner. You don't owe me anything." Ranger moved to the door and sat facing outward, his body alert and ready. Tom Brennan looked at the dog, at the cabin, at the photo of Margaret on the mantel. Then he started to prepare. Tom spent the afternoon turning his home into a fortress. Not the dramatic kind you saw in movies with sandbags and barricades and enough firepower to hold off an army. Just the practical preparations of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to stay alive when the odds weren't in his favor. Small things, smart things, the kind of defensive measures that gave you seconds when seconds mattered most. He started outside, walking the perimeter of the property with Ranger moving slowly beside him. The dog's limp was pronounced, but the animal refused to stay inside, matching Tom's pace with stubborn determination. Together, they cataloged sightlines and approach vectors, the tactical assessment coming back to Tom like muscle memory. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by pine forest on three sides, and backed against a rocky outcrop that rose 20 feet into the air. Good defensive position, limited approaches. But the clearing also meant exposure, and the tree line offered plenty of cover for anyone smart enough to use it. Tom marked the most likely routes in his mind. The gravel driveway that connected to the main road wide enough for vehicles and the obvious choice for a direct assault. The game trail that wound through the western woods, narrow but passable for men on foot. The creek bed to the south, mostly frozen this time of year, but offering a covered approach if someone was willing to get wet and cold. He set his defenses accordingly. Tripwires strung across the driveway attached to wind chimes he pulled from the shed. Nothing fancy, just early warning. The same setup along the game trail, this time using empty cans filled with pebbles. At the creek bed, he scattered broken glass from old bottles, the kind of thing that would crunch loudly underfoot and slow anyone trying to move quietly. All civilian materials, nothing that would get him arrested for booby-trapping his own property. Just noisemakers and inconveniences that would buy him time to respond. Inside, Tom moved furniture with deliberate care. The heavy oak bookshelf repositioned to cover the front window, leaving just enough gap to see out, but making it harder for anyone to see in. The couch angled to provide cover from the door while maintaining sight lines to the kitchen and bedroom. Margaret's antique china cabinet, the one piece of furniture he'd never had the heart to move after she died, pushed against the wall where it wouldn't catch a stray bullet. Ranger watched from his position near the fireplace, head resting on his paws, but eyes tracking every movement. Tom checked his weapons. The hunting rifle he'd bought 20 years ago for elk season, scoped and accurate at distance. The shotgun his father had given him when he turned at 18, pump action and reliable. And the service pistol he'd carried for 3 decades, cleaned and maintained, even though he promised himself he'd never need to fire it again. 3 weapons. Enough ammunition for each. Not an arsenal, just the tools of a man who'd lived in bear country and understood that sometimes you needed to defend yourself from things with teeth and claws, or things with grudges and motorcycles. He loaded each weapon methodically, his hands steady and practiced. Set them in strategic locations around the cabin. Rifle by the front window, shotgun near the bedroom door, pistol on his hip, the weight familiar and unwelcome. The sun was setting by the time he finished, the sky turning shades of orange and purple that Margaret had always loved. Tom stood on the porch and watched the light fade, his breath misting in the cold air, and wondered if Derek Vance would actually show. Maybe the confrontation at the gas station had been enough. Maybe Derek would think better of it, decide that revenge wasn't worth the risk, find some other way to process his anger at a dead father and a life that hadn't turned out the way he'd wanted. Tom had seen men make that choice before, had watched enemies back down when they realized the cost was too high, when survival instinct overrode pride and fury. But he'd also seen men who couldn't let go, who'd rather die than admit defeat, who carried their rage like a banner and marched straight into destruction because anything else felt like surrender. Derek Vance's eyes had held that kind of rage. Tom went inside and made coffee, fed Ranger, who ate slowly but steadily, the dog's appetite returning with each passing day. Then he settled into the chair by the window, the rifle across his lap, and waited. The hours crawled past. 8 o'clock came and went. 9, 10. The forest outside grew darker, the moon hidden behind clouds that promised more snow. Tom sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, listening to the cabin settle and creak around him, his mind quiet and focused. Ranger lifted his head at 11:15. The dog's ears swiveled toward the front of the property, his body going tense and alert. No growl yet, just that sudden shift from rest to readiness that Tom had learned to read over the past week. Tom killed the lamp and moved to the window, staying low and to the side. Listened. At first, nothing, just wind through the pines and the soft tick of the cooling wood stove. Then he heard it, the faint metallic clatter of wind chimes dancing in still air. Someone had triggered the tripwire on the driveway. Tom's heartbeat remained steady, adrenaline sharpening his senses without overwhelming them. He counted to 10, giving his eyes time to adjust to the darkness outside. Scanned the tree line visible through the gap in the bookshelf. Movement. Shadows separating from shadows, low and deliberate. Multiple figures, maybe 6 or 7, spreading out along the edge of the clearing. They'd come on foot, leaving their motorcycles somewhere down the road to avoid the noise. Smart. It meant they were taking this seriously, treating it like an actual operation instead of a drunken rampage. Tom felt a cold respect for the tactical thinking, even as he calculated firing angles and retreat options. The cans on the game trail rattled softly. Western approached 2 more contacts. That made 8, maybe 9 total. More than he'd expected, more than Derek could have gathered from his crew alone. Word must have spread. Other men with other grudges seeing an opportunity to settle old scores against the veteran who testified against one of their own. Tom moved to the center of the room where he had sight lines to multiple windows. Ranger stayed close, the dogs breathing quiet, and controlled every muscle coiled with disciplined tension. A voice called out from the darkness, amplified and distorted. Derek using a megaphone or bullhorn. "Brennan, we're going to make this simple. Come out now, face me like a man, and maybe we only burn the cabin. Stay inside and you burn with it." Tom said nothing. Giving away his position inside the cabin would only help them plan their approach. "You've got 60 seconds to decide." Tom used the time to final check his weapons and run through scenarios. 9 men, probably armed, definitely angry. Defending from inside gave him cover and limited their angles of attack, but also trapped him if they managed to breach or start a fire. The alternative was going outside, meeting them in the open. Suicide, realistically. 9 against 1, even with his training, the numbers weren't survivable, unless he changed the equation. Tom moved to the back door, the one that opened onto a small neck overlooking the rocky outcrop. Unlocked it quietly, leaving it ready to open in a hurry. Then he returned to his position in the living room. Ranger's growl started low, a rumble from deep in the chest that Tom felt more than heard. "Time's up, old man." The first Molotov cocktail came through the western window in an explosion of glass and flame. Tom hit the floor, rolling away from the spray of burning alcohol as it splashed across the hardwood and ignited the curtains Margaret had sewn by hand 20 years ago. The heat flared bright and immediate shadows dancing wild across the walls. 2 more bottles came through the front window, shattering the bookshelf and sending books tumbling into pools of fire. Tom didn't waste time fighting the flames. The cabin was already lost, at least this room. What mattered now was getting out before the smoke got thick enough to kill him. He grabbed Ranger's collar, pulling the dog toward the bedroom, even as voices shouted outside and boots thundered on the porch. The front door splintered under a heavy kick, cold air rushing in to feed the growing fire. Tom slammed the bedroom door and threw the deadbolt, buying himself maybe 30 seconds. Grabbed the shotgun and moved to the back door, Ranger pressed against his leg. "When I open this," Tom said quietly to the dog, "you run for the outcrop and you don't stop. Understand?" Ranger's eyes met his in the flickering light from the flames now licking under the bedroom door. Tom opened the back door and pushed Ranger through ahead of him. The dog ran, favoring his injured leg, but moving with surprising speed across the snow-covered deck. Tom followed, bringing the shotgun up as a figure rounded the corner of the cabin with a rifle raised. Tom fired first. The blast took the man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways and sending him down into the snow. Non-lethal, but effective. Tom pumped another round and kept moving his boots, finding purchase on the icy deck boards. Two more men appeared from the tree line, moving toward Ranger with weapons drawn. "Down!" Tom shouted and fired again. The buckshot went wide, deliberately kicking up snow between the men and the dog. They dove for cover, and in that moment, Ranger disappeared behind the outcrop. Tom followed, sliding down the rocky slope as bullets cracked overhead and splintered the deck railing above him. He hit the ground hard, his 62-year-old body protesting the impact, and scrambled for cover behind a boulder. Ranger was already there, pressed against the stone, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight from the burning cabin. Tom's chest heaved as he caught his breath, his ears ringing from the shotgun blasts. Behind and above them, the cabin that had been his and Margaret's dream was being consumed by flames, black smoke rolling into the night sky. Voices shouted orders. Boots crunched through snow. Someone was coordinating them, keeping them organized despite the chaos. Derek had brought professionals, or at least men with military experience. Tom checked his shotgun. 3 shells left. The pistol on his hip held 15 rounds. No rifle, he'd left it in the bedroom when the fire started. 28 rounds against 9 men. The math wasn't good. Ranger shifted beside him, and Tom felt the dog's attention fix on something to their left. He followed the animal's gaze and saw what had captured Ranger's focus. A path barely visible in the snow, leading deeper into the rocks behind the outcrop. Tom had explored this area when they'd first bought the property, but that had been years ago. The path led to a small cave, maybe 10 feet deep, formed by 2 massive boulders leaning against each other. And beyond the cave, barely visible in the darkness, something else caught Tom's eye. A mound of disturbed earth, recent digging partially covered by fresh snow. And next to it, planted in the frozen ground, a simple wooden cross made from 2 branches lashed together with paracord. Military field grave marker. Tom's breath caught. Ranger was already moving toward it, the dog's limp pronounced, but his purpose clear. Tom followed, keeping low, using the rocks for cover, as shouts echoed from the direction of the burning cabin. They reached the grave site, and Tom knelt beside it, his hand on Ranger's shoulder. The cross bore no name, just a set of dog tags hanging from the horizontal beam. Tom lifted them into the faint light from the distant fire. Corporal Wade Hutchins, U.S. Army K. IA June 2024. The same name from Ranger's collar. Tom's mind raced through the implications. Ranger had brought his handler here, to the specific spot behind the specific cabin 6 months ago. Had dug the grave, buried the body, marked it with field ceremony, and then collapsed from exhaustion and infection. But why here? Tom looked around with fresh eyes, taking in details he'd missed before. The cave behind them wasn't natural, he realized now. The rocks had been deliberately stacked in position, creating a shelter, and inside, barely visible, the remnants of military gear. A pack, a bedroll, supplies. Someone had camped here, recently enough that the gear hadn't degraded. Wade Hutchins had been here, had chosen this location for a reason. Tom's cabin wasn't random. "Brennan," Derek's voice carried across the clearing. "Your house is gone. Come out now and I might let you live." Tom didn't answer. He was studying the grave, the positioning, the tactical significance of this location. The outcrop provided high ground and cover. The rocks created multiple defensive positions. The cave offered shelter and concealment, and the location itself was within sight of the cabin, but hidden from casual observation. This was an observation post. Wade Hutchins hadn't stumbled across Tom's property by accident. The corporal had been watching the cabin, watching Tom, for weeks, maybe months before he died. But why Ranger pressed against his leg and Tom felt the dog trembling. Not from cold or fear, but from something else, recognition, memory, the weight of a mission incomplete. You brought him here to rest, Tom said quietly to the dog, but there's something else, isn't there? Something he wanted you to protect. Ranger moved to the cave entrance. Tom followed his tactical awareness, screaming at him to stay alert for the men hunting him, but his instinct telling him this mattered more. Inside the cave, he found it. A metal ammunition box, military issue, sealed with a combination lock. The kind of container used for sensitive documents or equipment that needed to stay dry and secure. Tom pulled it from its hiding place, the weight and balance telling him it was full. No time to try combinations now, not with Derek's crew closing in. He grabbed the box and Wade Hutchins' pack, slinging both over his shoulder. "We need to move," Tom said to Ranger. The dog was already heading deeper into the rocks, following a path Tom couldn't see, but Ranger clearly knew. They climbed higher, moving away from the cabin, and the men below the terrain growing rougher and more vertical. Behind them, the cabin's roof collapsed with a groan and a shower of sparks that lit up the night. Tom didn't look back. They climbed for 20 minutes, Ranger setting a pace that pushed Tom's endurance to its limits. His lungs burned in the cold air, his legs screamed with exhaustion, but he kept moving. The dog had survived 6 months alone in these mountains. If Ranger said this path was safe, Tom would trust that judgment. They emerged onto a small plateau sheltered by overhanging rock and dense pine cover. A defensive position with sightlines back toward the cabin and multiple escape roads. Tom sank down against a boulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ranger settled beside him, the dog's sides heaving, but his attention still fixed on the trail behind them. Down below, flashlight beams cut through the darkness around the burning cabin. Tom could hear voices, angry and frustrated, as Derek's crew realized their target had escaped. He pulled out his phone. No signal this deep in the mountains, but worth checking. Nothing. Tom looked at Ranger, who was watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. "Your handler knew something," Tom said quietly. "Something important enough to camp outside my cabin for months. Important enough to hide it here and send you to guard it after he died." He looked down at the ammunition box in his lap. "Guess we'd better find out what it was." The combination lock was military standard 6 digits. Tom tried the obvious ones first. Hutchins's birthday, if he could guess it. Service number sequences. Common tactical codes. Nothing worked. He was about to give up when Ranger moved closer, pressing his nose against the side of the box. The dog pawed at it once deliberately, then looked at Tom. "You know the combination," Tom said. Ranger's tail moved once. Tom studied the dog, thinking. Military working dogs were trained for dozens of specialized tasks. Detection, patrol, protection. Some were taught to respond to specific number sequences, touch commands that handlers could give silently in the field. "Show me," Tom said. He held the dial in position and watched Ranger. The dog lifted his right paw, touched Tom's hand once. Tom turned the dial 1 click to the right. Ranger's paw came down twice. 2 clicks. They worked through it slowly, Ranger indicating each number with patient precision. 6 digits total, and on the final turn, the lock clicked open. Tom lifted the lid. Inside, sealed in plastic bags, were documents, photographs, USB drives, and a letter addressed in neat handwriting to a name Tom recognized. Colonel Richard Morrison, Fort Carson, Colorado. The same base where Rob Hartley had died 6 years ago. Tom opened the letter carefully, his hand shaking slightly. "Colonel Morrison, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. The package I've been protecting is evidence of corruption that reaches higher than either of us expected. I've confirmed at least 3 senior officers involved in weapons trafficking using military transport to move illegal arms to domestic militias. They know I have proof. They've already tried to kill me twice. I need you to get this to someone you trust. Someone outside the chain of command who can't be bought or threatened. I remember you talking about Tom Brennan, the SEAL who testified against Sheriff Vance. You said he was the most honest man you ever served with. If I don't make it, my K9 Ranger will find him. The dog has his scent from a photo I kept. He'll protect the package until Brennan can get it to safety. Tell Brennan I'm sorry for bringing this to his door, but I couldn't think of anyone else to trust. Corporal Wade Hutchins. Tom read the letter 3 times, his mind processing implications and connections. Colonel Morrison had been Rob Hartley's commanding officer, had spoken about Tom to his soldiers, apparently with enough respect that a dying corporal had bet everything on that recommendation. And Ranger had been trained, deliberately programmed to find Tom, to bring this evidence to someone Wade Hutchins believed would do the right thing, even if it cost him everything. Tom looked at the dog, who was watching him with patient intelligence. "You've been trying to complete your mission this whole time," Tom said quietly. "That's why you buried your handler near my cabin instead of anywhere else. Why you kept going when any other dog would have given up. You had orders." Ranger's tail wagged once. Tom carefully packed the documents back into the box and sealed it. Then he pulled out his phone again, praying for even one bar of signal. Still nothing. They'd have to wait until dawn, then move to higher ground where he might be able to make a call. In the meantime, they were stuck here while Derek's crew hunted through the forest below. Tom settled in against the rock, the ammunition box secured beside him, and the shotgun across his lap. Ranger pressed against his side, warmth and solidarity in the freezing darkness. "We're going to finish this," Tom said to the dog. "Your mission and mine both. But first, we've got to survive the night." The hours crawled past. Tom dozed in fits and starts, snapping awake at every sound that carried up from below. Voices calling to each other. Engines starting and stopping. The distant crack of wood as the cabin's walls finally collapsed completely. Around 4 in the morning, a new sound cut through the darkness. Sirens. Tom moved to the edge of the plateau and looked down. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, emergency vehicles arriving at what was left of his property. Fire trucks, probably too late to save anything. And sheriff's vehicles, their searchlights sweeping across the clearing. Derek's crew would be gone by now, melted back into the forest and scattered before law enforcement could identify them. Smart, disciplined, exactly what Tom would have done in their position. But they'd be back. Men like Derek Vance didn't give up after one failed attempt. They regrouped, planned better, came back harder. And next time they'd know Tom was prepared, that he wouldn't be caught off guard. The mathematics of the situation hadn't changed. Tom was still one man alone against enemies who outnumbered and outpositioned him, except he wasn't alone. Ranger shifted beside him and Tom made a decision. When dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, Tom picked up the ammunition box and started climbing toward higher ground, Ranger leading the way. It took an hour to reach a ridge where his phone finally showed one flickering bar of signal. He pulled up his contacts and made a call he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Sarah Hartley answered on the second ring, her voice tight with worry. "Tom, thank God, I saw the smoke last night. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Ranger too. Sarah, I need help." A pause. "Tell me what you need." "Derek Vance and his crew burning my cabin. They'll come back probably tonight or tomorrow. I can't fight them alone." "You're not alone." Sarah's voice shifted, becoming harder and more focused. "Rob made me promise something before his last deployment. If you ever needed backup, I was supposed to call in the unit. His old team from Iraq. Do you remember them?" Tom closed his eyes, memories flooding back. Rob's platoon. Men he'd served alongside in Fallujah watched grow from scared recruits into seasoned soldiers. Men who'd scattered across the country after their service ended trying to build civilian lives. "I remember. They're still around. Most of them settled within 100 miles of here. VFW guys now, but they remember what you did for them. Remember that you pulled Rob out of a burning Humvee and kept him alive long enough to see his daughter born." Sarah's voice softened. "They'll come, Tom. If I ask, they'll come." Tom looked down at Ranger, who was watching him with patient trust. "Make the calls," Tom said quietly. "Tell them to meet at the ridge above my property, and Sarah, tell them to come armed." They arrived in the early afternoon. 4 men, ages ranging from 55 to 70, driving pickup trucks. that had seen better days but still ran strong. They climbed out at the rendezvous point Tom had specified, and he recognized each face despite the years and gray hair and extra weight that came with civilian life. Marcus Webb, who'd been Rob's radio operator and now ran a hardware store in Kalispell. Luther Hayes, the medic, who'd saved more lives than anyone could count, retired now but still volunteering at the VA clinic. James Porter, sniper and mechanic living on disability after losing his left leg below the knee to an IED. And David Sullivan, the youngest of the group at 55, who'd been their demolitions expert and now taught chemistry at the community college. Each man carried a rifle. Sarah arrived last, driving her late husband's truck and bringing supplies. Food, water, ammunition, first aid gear, the logistics of a military operation organized by someone who'd been doing this kind of preparation for 20 years as a military spouse. They gathered in a circle, these aging warriors who traded combat boots for work boots but hadn't forgotten the fundamentals. Tom briefed them quickly. Derek Vance, the attack on the cabin, the evidence Ranger had been protecting, the probability that another assault would come soon, and this time it would be planned better. So we're defending, Marcus said, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes. How many are we expecting? At least 9 last night, probably more if Derek calls in reinforcements. Luther whistled low. 7 of us counting you and Sarah, plus 1 gimpy dog, against a dozen or more angry bikers. We fought worse odds, James said quietly, his hand unconsciously moving to where his prosthetic leg attached. That was 30 years ago, David pointed out. We're not exactly in fighting shape anymore. Maybe not, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the discussion. But we're smart, and we know how to work together. That counts for more than being young and stupid. She looked at each man in turn. Rob died believing in something, believing that what we did mattered, that protecting each other meant something. I won't let his memory be used to justify running away when Tom needs us. The men exchanged glances. Some unspoken communication passed between them, the language of soldiers who'd bled together and knew the cost of the promise they were about to make. Marcus spoke first. I'm in. In, Luther echoed. Hell yes, from James. David took longer but finally nodded. In. But someone needs to tell my wife if I don't make it home. Sarah smiled tight and fierce. I'll tell her you died defending a brother. She'll understand. Tom felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. I can't ask you to do this. Can't promise it won't go bad. Can't even promise we'll win. You're not asking, Marcus said. We're volunteering. Difference matters. Rob would have done the same for any of us, Luther added. We're just paying forward. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Tom laid out the terrain using a stick in the dirt marking sight lines and defensive positions. The cabin was gone, but the outcrop remained and the surrounding forest provided multiple fallback positions if they needed to retreat. Marcus suggested tripwires and noisemakers similar to what Tom had already deployed. Luther focused on medical evacuation routes and casualty treatment. James picked sniper positions with overlapping fields of fire. David calculated sight lines and kill zones with the precision of someone who'd spent years teaching geometry to teenagers. Sarah coordinated logistics, making sure they had enough ammunition, water, and supplies to sustain a defensive action for at least 12 hours. And through it all, Ranger moved among them, accepting scratches behind the ears and quiet words of respect from men who recognized a fellow veteran when they saw one. When the planning was done, they dispersed to their positions and waited. The attack came at dusk. 14 motorcycles, this time roaring up the access road with the kind of confidence that came from superior numbers. They stopped at the edge of the clearing where Tom's cabin had stood, engines idling, surveying the burned wreckage. Derek Vance climbed off his bike, a megaphone in his hand. Brennan, I know you're out here. You can't hide forever. Tom didn't answer. He was positioned behind the outcrop Ranger beside him, watching through binoculars as Derek's crew fanned out. 14 men, all armed, some with rifles, others with pistols. None of them looked like they were planning to leave until the job was done. Derek raised the megaphone again. Last chance, old man. Come out and face me, or we burn these woods down around you. From his position 300 yards away, James Porter settled his rifle against a fallen log and acquired a target. Not Derek, not yet. One of the lieutenants standing near the edge of the group with an AR-15 held loosely in his hands. James breathed out slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle crack echoed across the clearing. The man with the AR-15 spun and went down, hit in the shoulder, non-lethal but effective. Chaos erupted. Derek's crew dove for cover weapons, coming up searching for the source of the shot. Return fire poured into the tree line, wild and undisciplined bullets cutting through branches and kicking up snow. From his position on the opposite side of the clearing, Marcus opened fire. Controlled bursts forcing Derek's men to stay low and lose their tactical cohesion. Fall back to secondary positions. Derek's voice cut through the chaos, surprisingly calm. Flanking maneuver standard assault pattern. Tom's respect for Derek's tactical ability went up a notch even as it confirmed his worst fear. Derek had military training, or at least someone in his crew did. This wasn't going to be a simple defense against an angry mob. This was going to be a real fight. Derek's crew split into 3 groups. One stayed to provide suppressing fire. The other 2 moved to flank using the forest cover to advance on the positions where James and Marcus were shooting from. Standard infantry tactics, effective against stationary defenders. But Tom's team wasn't stationary. At his signal, James and Marcus fell back to pre-planned secondary positions, moving quickly through paths they'd scouted earlier. Derek's flanking groups advanced into empty space, finding nothing but abandoned firing positions and more tripwires. Wind chimes jangled, cans rattled. Confusion spread through Derek's crew as they realized they were fighting ghosts. Tom keyed his radio, the old military handset Sarah had provided from Rob's gear. Luther David, you're up. Hit them from behind. Copy that, Luther's voice crackled back. 2 more rifles opened fire from a completely unexpected direction behind and to the right of Derek's position. The crew scattered, some diving for their motorcycles, others trying to return fire while dealing with threats from multiple angles. Derek's voice cut through the chaos, still trying to maintain control. Rally point form up at the rally point. But his crew was breaking. Men were running for the motorcycles, others were pinned down by covering fire, and the tight discipline Derek had tried to impose was fracturing under the pressure of fighting an enemy they couldn't see or pin down. The sheriff's sirens cut through the gunfire like a knife, multiple vehicles approaching fast from the main road, red and blue lights flashing through the trees. Derek's crew didn't wait to be arrested. They broke and ran mounting motorcycles and scattering in every direction. Within 60 seconds, the clearing was empty, except for 2 wounded men who couldn't ride in the destroyed remains of Tom's cabin. Tom stayed in position, watching through his binoculars as sheriff's deputies swept the area and secured the wounded. Ranger pressed against his leg, the dog's body tense but controlled. Stand down, Tom said into the radio. Law enforcement is here. Everyone stay hidden until they clear out. Acknowledgments came back from his team, one by one. They'd held 7 aging veterans and 1 injured dog against 14 armed men, and they'd held. Tom allowed himself one small moment of satisfaction before the weight of what came next settled back onto his shoulders. The sheriff's department would want answers, would want to know who'd been shooting, who'd been defending, who was responsible for the escalation. And Tom would have to decide how much truth to tell and how much to keep hidden until he could get Wade Hutchins' evidence into the right hands. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight they'd survived. The sheriff's department kept Tom and his team separated for 3 hours, taking statements in the backs of patrol while crime scene technicians photographed the burned cabin and collected shell casings from the clearing. Tom sat in Deputy Miller's Cruiser Ranger on the ground outside the open door and answered questions with practiced patience. Yes, he owned the property. Yes, Derek Vance had threatened him at the gas station. Yes, he prepared defensive measures. No, he hadn't fired the first shot tonight. No, he wasn't sure who had given that he'd been taking cover when the shooting started. All technically true, all carefully worded to avoid incriminating himself or his friends. Deputy Miller was young, maybe 30, with the earnest expression of someone who still believed the job was about helping people rather than processing paperwork. He took notes carefully, occasionally glancing at Ranger with the kind of respect civilians reserve for working dogs. "Mr. Brennan," Miller said, finally closing his notebook, "I'm going to be straight with you. We've got two wounded suspects claiming you, and persons unknown ambushed them. We've got evidence of a coordinated defensive action involving multiple shooters. And we've got a property owner who just lost his home to arson." Tom said nothing, waiting. "Legally, you were defending your property against an armed attack. Montana law is pretty clear on that. But my sergeant is going to want to know who else was here tonight, who was shooting, who helped you set up what looks like a military operation on civilian ground." "I was alone," Tom said quietly. "Me and my dog." Miller's expression said he didn't believe that for a second, but after a moment he sighed and opened the car door. "Stay available for follow-up questions. And Mr. Brennan, you might want to talk to a lawyer." Tom climbed out of the cruiser, his joints protesting after sitting still for so long. Ranger stood immediately, pressing against his leg as they walked back toward where the cabin had stood. Nothing remained but charred timbers and the stone foundation. 34 years of memories reduced to ash and twisted metal. The wood stove Margaret had picked out at an estate sale. The porch where they'd watched sunsets together. The bedroom where she died holding his hand. All gone. Tom stood at the edge of the destruction and felt surprisingly little. Maybe he'd already done his grieving. Maybe the cabin had served its purpose, keeping him alive and isolated until he was ready to rejoin the world. Or maybe he was just too tired to process one more loss. Sarah appeared at his elbow, her presence quiet and solid. "The others got away clean. Sheriff never saw them, and the wounded guys aren't talking, but we should probably stay scarce for a few days." "Thank you," Tom said, "for calling them, for coming yourself." "Rob would have done the same." She looked at the burned cabin. "Where are you going to stay?" Tom hadn't thought that far ahead. The cabin had been his entire world for 3 years. Without it, he felt unmoored adrift in a way he hadn't since Margaret's funeral. "I've got a spare room," Sarah offered. "It's not much, but it's warm. You and Ranger are welcome as long as you need." Before Tom could answer, another vehicle pulled up the access road. Not a sheriff's cruiser this time, but an unmarked SUV with government plates. A man climbed out mid-30s wearing a deputy's uniform, but carrying himself with the kind of confidence that suggested more than just local law enforcement. He was tall, solidly built with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and eyes that tracked movement with tactical awareness. He walked directly to Tom, hand extended. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Officer Ryan Blake. I work with the Sheriff's Department, but I'm also a veteran advocate attached to the local VA office." Tom shook his hand, feeling calluses that spoke of someone who still trained hard despite the desk job. "I heard about the attack," Blake continued. "Wanted to check on you personally. Make sure you're getting the support you need." There was something in his tone, a weight to the words that suggested this wasn't just a professional courtesy call. "I'm managing," Tom said carefully. Blake glanced at Ranger, who was watching him with patient attention. "Military working dog. His handler died 6 months ago. I found him during the blizzard last week. That must have been hard, losing a handler like that." Blake crouched down slowly, making himself less threatening. "My father worked with K-9 units in Iraq. He used to say the dogs understood loss better than most humans." Something in the way Blake said it made Tom look at him more closely. "Your father was a K-9 handler." "Sergeant. Infantry mostly, but he worked with the dog teams on detection operations." Blake stood, his eyes meeting Tom's with sudden intensity. "Fallujah 2004. He was pinned down in a Humvee that took an RPG. Said a SEAL pulled him out while the vehicle was burning, kept him alive until medevac arrived." The memory surfaced like something from someone else's life. Smoke and flames. A man screaming inside a burning vehicle. Tom's hands dragging dead weight through a door twisted off its hinges, his uniform catching fire, the smell of burning flesh and melting rubber. Sergeant Michael Blake, Tom said quietly. Ryan's expression confirmed it. You saved his life. He came home to my mother, raised me, and my sister lived another 18 years before cancer got him. In every single one of those years, he told us about the SEAL who didn't leave him behind, who risked his own life for a soldier he'd never met before that day. Tom felt something shift in his chest. I didn't know he'd passed. I'm sorry. Don't be. He lived well. Died surrounded by family. Ryan pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Tom. He also made me promise something. If I ever met you, I was supposed to say thank you and to offer whatever help you needed, no questions asked. Tom took the card, the simple gesture carrying more weight than Ryan probably realized. I appreciate that. There's something else. Ryan glanced around, making sure they had relative privacy. My sergeant mentioned you might have been defending against multiple assailants, that there might have been others helping you, though you're not saying who. Tom remained silent. I'm not asking you to confirm anything, Ryan continued, but if you were hypothetically working with other veterans, hypothetically coordinating a defensive action, you should know that the local VFW chapter has resources, legal support, counseling, a community of people who understand what it's like to stand your ground when you have to. I'm not much of a joiner, Tom said. Neither was my father. After he came home from Iraq, he isolated for 2 years. Couldn't connect with anyone who hadn't been through what he'd been through. Then someone from the VFW showed up at his door and just kept showing up until he agreed to come to a meeting. Ryan's voice softened. He said it saved his life, gave him a reason to keep going when the nightmares got bad. Tom looked down at Ranger, who was watching the exchange with those deep knowing eyes. We meet Thursday nights, Ryan said. 7 o'clock at the hall on Pine Street. Just coffee and conversation. No pressure, no judgment. But if you wanted to come, there are people there who'd like to meet you. People who remember Sergeant Blake's story, who know what you did. I'll think about it, Tom said, which was more commitment than he'd expected to give. Ryan nodded, understanding when to push and when to back off. That's all I'm asking. And Mr. Brennan, whatever happens with the investigation, whatever the sheriff's department decides you were defending your home, Montana law is on your side. Don't let anyone tell you different. He returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving Tom standing in the ruins with questions multiplying in his mind. Sarah touched his arm gently. You should go. To the VFW, I mean. Rob always said the meetings helped him process things, gave him perspective. I don't need perspective. I need a plan for what to do with Wade Hutchins' evidence. Then bring it to people you can trust, people who've served, people who understand what it means to complete a mission. She gestured at the burned cabin. You can't do this alone anymore, Tom. You've already proven that tonight. Let the community help. Tom looked at the ammunition box sitting in the back of Sarah's truck covered with a tarp. Inside were documents that could bring down corruption at levels he couldn't even fully comprehend. Evidence that Wade Hutchins had died protecting. Evidence that Ranger had been trained to deliver to someone trustworthy. And maybe, just maybe, the VFW chapter contained people who could help him figure out what to do with it. Thursday night, Tom said finally. I'll go Thursday night. The VFW hall was smaller than Tom expected, a simple single-story building with peeling paint and a flagpole out front that had seen better days. Cars filled the parking lot, trucks, mostly the kind of practical vehicles owned by people who valued function over appearance. Tom sat in Sarah's borrowed truck for a full 5 minutes, Ranger in the passenger seat beside him, before he found the courage to get out. It's just coffee and conversation, he muttered to the dog. Nothing I can't handle. Ranger's expression suggested skepticism. Tom climbed out, Ranger following, and walked to the front door. Inside, he could hear voices and laughter, the sound of people comfortable with each other. He almost turned around and left. Then the door opened, and Ryan Blake stood there smiling like he'd been waiting. "Mr. Brennan, glad you could make it. Come on in." The interior was exactly what Tom expected. Folding tables arranged in a loose circle, a coffee station against one wall, photographs covering every available surface, men and women in uniform from every conflict since World War II, and people, maybe 15 of them, ages ranging from late 50s to early 80s, all turning to look as Tom and Ranger entered. Ryan made introductions. "Everyone, this is Tom Brennan, Navy SEAL retired. Tom, this is our Thursday night group." The names came fast. Marcus Webb and Luther Hayes, who Tom already knew from the fight. James Porter still using his cane but standing to shake Tom's hand with genuine warmth. David Sullivan offering a quiet nod of recognition. And others. Catherine Morrison, who insisted everyone call her Kate, a former Army medic with steel gray hair and kind eyes. Frank Delacroix, Marine Corps Vietnam veteran, who looked Tom up and down and pronounced him acceptable. Patricia Hoffman, Navy nurse who immediately crouched to greet Ranger with a kind of competence that suggested she'd worked with military dogs before. Sarah was already there, settled into a chair with coffee in hand and an expression that said she'd been expecting Tom to show. "Grab some coffee," Kate said, gesturing to the pot. "Fair warning, it's terrible, but it's our terrible coffee, so we drink it anyway." Tom poured himself a cup, the liquid black as oil, and probably just as toxic, and settled into an empty folding chair. Ranger lay at his feet, accepting attention from those close enough to reach him. "So," Frank said, his voice carrying the rasp of too many cigarettes over too many years, "Ryan tells us you had some excitement at your place earlier this week." "My cabin burned down," Tom said carefully. "Arson. Anyone hurt? Two of theirs, none of ours." Frank grunted approval. "Good defensive action then. Well executed." "I had help." "Always do." Frank leaned back in his chair. "That's what this is about, you know. The meetings. Reminding each other that we don't have to fight alone anymore. That there are people who understand." Kate picked up the thread. "We've all been where you are, Tom. Coming home from service and not knowing how to be civilians again. Losing people we love and not knowing how to process the grief. Feeling like we don't fit anywhere except with others who've been through the same fire. Some of us handled it better than others," Patricia added quietly. "I spent 2 years drinking myself to death before Frank showed up at my house and literally dragged me to a meeting." "You tried to punch me," Frank said mildly. "You deserved it." Patricia smiled, the expression out and genuine. "But you kept coming back, kept showing up until I couldn't pretend I was fine anymore." Tom sipped the terrible coffee and said nothing, feeling the weight of their attention without pressure or judgment. "We're not going to force you to share," Kate said. "Some people come to these meetings for months before they're ready to talk. That's fine. We just ask that you show up. Be present. Let yourself be part of something again." "I lost my wife 3 years ago," Tom heard himself say. The room went quiet but not uncomfortable, just attentive. "Cancer," Tom continued. "She was diagnosed while I was deployed on a training exercise. By the time I got home, the doctors gave her 4 months. We got 2. He stared into his coffee cup. "I spent those 2 months watching her die, holding her hand, promising her things I knew I couldn't deliver. And when she was gone, I didn't know what to do with myself. So I went to the cabin we'd bought for retirement, and I just stopped. Stopped connecting with people. Stopped caring about anything except making it through one more day." He looked up and found understanding in every face around the circle. "For 3 years, I convinced myself that was enough. That survival was sufficient. That I didn't need purpose or community or anything beyond basic existence." His hand dropped to Ranger's head, fingers tangling in warm fur. "Then I found this dog dying in a ditch during a blizzard, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning. Something that needed me. Something I could actually help. And now," Kate asked gently, "now I don't know. The cabin's gone. The isolation I'd built is broken. And I'm sitting in a VFW hall with strangers who somehow feel less strange than they should. That's because we're not strangers, Marcus said. We're family. Different kind of family than blood, but family just the same. We've all bled for the same flag, all carried the same weight, all come home to a world that doesn't quite understand what we've seen. And we take care of our own, Luther added. That's not optional. That's who we are. Ryan stood and refilled his coffee cup, his movements casual but his voice serious. Tom, you saved my father's life in Fallujah. Gave him 18 more years to watch his kids grow up, to meet his grandchildren, to live with purpose and dignity. That debt doesn't expire. There's no debt, Tom said quietly. Maybe not to you, but to us there is. Ryan looked around the circle. We all owe someone, someone who pulled us out of a fire, literal or otherwise, someone who stayed when they could have run, someone who gave us a chance when we didn't deserve one. And the way we repay that debt is by being that person for someone else. Kate leaned forward, her eyes intense. You don't have to figure everything out tonight, Tom. You don't have to commit to anything or make promises you're not ready to keep. Just come back next week and the week after that. Let yourself be part of this community while you figure out what comes next. Tom looked at Ranger, who was watching him with patient attention. The dog had carried Wade Hutchins' mission for 6 months, had survived alone in the mountains protecting evidence and searching for someone trustworthy enough to complete a dead handler's final orders. If Ranger could do that, Tom could show up to a Thursday night meeting. I'll come back, he said. The relief in Sarah's expression told him she'd been worried he'd refuse. The conversation moved on to other topics after that. Frank told a story about his granddaughter's soccer game that had the whole room laughing. Patricia shared an update about a young veteran she'd been mentoring through PTSD treatment. Marcus and Luther debated the best way to winterize a truck for Montana weather. Tom mostly listened, but occasionally found himself contributing. A comment here, a shared memory there. Small connections, careful and tentative, like someone learning to walk after a long injury. When the meeting ended 2 hours later, Kate pulled him aside. Tom, there's something you should know. I'm a retired Army medic, but before that I was married to a colonel at Fort Carson. Richard Morrison. He died 4 years ago, heart attack, but before he passed, he talked about one of his soldiers, Corporal Wade Hutchins. Tom's attention sharpened. Richard was worried about him, Kate continued. Said Wade had stumbled onto something dangerous and was trying to get evidence to the right people. Then Wade went missing and was declared KYA, and Richard always believed there was more to the story. She looked at Ranger. That's a military working dog. And unless I'm very wrong, Wade Hutchins was his handler. Tom made a decision. Can we talk somewhere private? They moved to a small office at the back of the hall. Just Tom, Kate, Ryan, and Sarah. Tom retrieved the ammunition box from Sarah's truck and brought it inside. Wade Hutchins left this, Tom said, setting the box on the desk. Evidence of weapons trafficking involving senior military officers. His final letter said he was trying to get it to Colonel Morrison. Said your husband had talked about me and that if Wade didn't survive, his dog would find me. Kate's hands shook as she opened the box and began sorting through the documents. Her expression grew harder with each page. Richard suspected this, she said finally. 3 officers at Fort Carson using military transport to move illegal weapons to domestic militias. He was trying to build a case when he died. I always wondered if the heart attack was really natural. What do we do with it? Ryan asked. Kate looked up, her eyes sharp and clear. We finish what Richard and Wade started. We get this to the FBI, to the Inspector General's office, to whoever has the authority and integrity to act on it. And we make sure Wade Hutchins' death meant something. I'll make the calls, Ryan said. I know some people at the federal level who aren't compromised. People who will take this seriously. Tom felt something heavy lift from his shoulders. The mission Wade had died for, the evidence Ranger had protected for 6 months, was finally going to reach the right hands. Thank you, he said quietly. Kate smiled. That's what family does, Tom. We finish each other's missions. 3 months later, Tom stood in front of the rebuilt cabin and felt something close to peace. Not his cabin, not exactly. The insurance money had covered basic reconstruction, but the VFW community had turned it into something more. Marcus and Luther had led the building crew coordinating volunteers from 3 counties. James had designed modifications for accessibility, remembering the aging veterans who might need to visit. David had installed a solar panel system that made the cabin self-sufficient, and Sarah had overseen it all, making sure every detail honored Margaret's memory while creating something new. The result was smaller than the original, more efficient, with a wraparound porch that could accommodate wheelchair access and large windows that let in light. Not a monument to the past, but a foundation for the future. Tom walked through the interior, Ranger at his side, taking in the simple furniture and practical layout. The bedroom where he'd placed Margaret's photo on the nightstand. The kitchen with a table big enough for guests. The living room with chairs arranged in a circle ready for the meetings that happen here twice a month now. The VFW Thursday night group had grown. Word had spread about the veteran who defended his home with help from aging warriors about the community that had rallied to rebuild what was lost. New faces appeared every week. Younger veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with wounds both visible and hidden. Older ones finally ready to stop isolating and start healing. And at the center of it, unexpectedly, was Tom. He'd started teaching tactical first aid, the skills learned over 3 decades of combat medicine. Then firearm safety, then basic survival skills for Montana winters. Small classes held in his living room or on the porch, filled with veterans who needed purpose and practical knowledge. But more than the classes, it was the conversations afterward that mattered. The quiet talks over coffee about loss and grief and how to keep living when everyone you loved was gone. The shared understanding that came from recognizing similar wounds in someone else's eyes. Tom had become what Frank and Kate and others had been for him. A steady presence. Someone who showed up and kept showing up until the isolation cracked and connection became possible. Sarah appeared in the doorway carrying a box of supplies for tonight's gathering. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Tonight was special. Wade Hutchins' family was coming to meet Ranger to understand what their son and brother had died protecting. The investigation into the weapons trafficking had led to 4 arrests so far, including 2 colonels and a general. The case was ongoing, but justice was moving forward slowly and deliberately, and Wade's mission was complete. The family arrived at 6. Mother, father, and a younger sister who looked maybe 12 years old. They climbed out of their car with the careful movements of people who'd been through too much grief and weren't sure how to process one more emotional moment. Tom met them on the porch, Ranger sitting calmly beside him. "Mr. and Mrs. Hutchins," Tom said quietly. "Thank you for coming." Wade's mother, a small woman with her son's dark eyes, looked at Ranger and her composure cracked. "That's really him, Wade's dog." "Yes, ma'am, this is Ranger." She knelt slowly and Ranger moved forward to meet her. The dog's tail wagged gently as she buried her face in his fur, her shoulders shaking with sobs she'd probably been holding back for 6 months. Wade's father stood with his hand on his daughter's shoulder, his jaw tight and his eyes wet. He talked about Ranger in his letters. Said the dog was the best partner he had ever had. Said if anything happened to him, Ranger would finish the mission. "He did," Tom said. "Carried your son's evidence across hundreds of miles, survived alone for months, and found me exactly like Wade planned. Without Ranger, the people responsible for your son's death would still be free." The sister pulled away from her father and approached Ranger carefully. "Can I pet him?" "Go ahead. He's gentle." She ran her hands over Ranger's head, her young face serious and sad. "Thank you for taking care of him, for making sure Wade's mission wasn't for nothing." Tom felt his throat tighten. "Your brother was a good soldier, a good man. He died protecting something important, and Ranger made sure that sacrifice mattered." They spent an hour together, the Hutchins family sharing stories about Wade, while Tom explained what had happened after he'd found Ranger, how the dog had recovered, how he'd revealed the evidence, how the mission had reached completion. When they left, Wade's mother hugged Tom with surprising strength. "You gave us closure," she said quietly, "and you gave Ranger a home. That means more than you know." After they drove away, Tom sat on the porch with Ranger and watched the sun set behind the mountains. "You did good, boy," he said to the dog. "Wade would be proud." Ranger's tail thumped against the wooden boards. People started arriving at 7. The Thursday night group, now too large for the VFW hall, had moved their meetings to Tom's cabin. 23 veterans filled the living room and spilled out onto the porch, ranging in age from 24 to 87. Kate brought her famous apple pie. Marcus and Luther arrived together, arguing good-naturedly about football. James rolled up in his modified truck, the vehicle fitted with hand controls that let him drive despite the prosthetic leg. Patricia came with 2 newer members, young women who'd served in Afghanistan and were still figuring out how to be civilians again. And Sarah moving through the gathering with quiet efficiency, making sure everyone had coffee and food and felt welcome. Ryan arrived last, bringing news. Derek Vance accepted a plea deal, reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against the people who supplied his crew with weapons. He'll do 5 years, maybe out in 3, with good behavior. Tom absorbed that information quietly. He'd visited Derek twice in the county jail, bringing books and offering to talk if Derek wanted to. The young man had been hostile the first time, refusing to even look at Tom. The second visit had been different. Derek had asked about his father, about what really happened during the corruption case. Tom had told him the truth, all of it, the things that hadn't come out in court. How Sheriff Marcus Vance had beaten a homeless veteran so badly, the man lost sight in one eye. How he'd planted drugs on teenagers whose parents couldn't afford lawyers. How he'd run protection rackets and blackmail schemes that destroyed families. "Your father was a bad man," Tom had said quietly, "but that doesn't mean you have to be. You can choose differently, make different decisions, build a different legacy." Derek had cried then, 25 years of anger, finally breaking open to reveal the grief underneath. "When he gets out," Tom said to Ryan, "now, tell him he's welcome at these meetings. Tell him we help veterans, but we also help any of you who's ready to do better." Ryan smiled. "I'll tell him." The meeting that night was louder than usual, filled with laughter and stories, and the kind of comfortable chaos that came from people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Tom found himself in the center of it, telling a story about a training mission gone wrong that had Marcus doubled over with laughter. Ranger worked the room like a professional, accepting attention from everyone and distributing calm presence like medicine. At some point, Kate stood and called for quiet. "I have an announcement," she said. "Tom and I have been working on something for the past month, a program we're calling Ranger's Legacy." Tom stood beside her, feeling nervous in a way he hadn't since his first combat deployment. "Military working dogs retire from service all the time," Kate continued. "Some get adopted by their handlers or other military families, but many don't. They end up in shelters or get euthanized because they're considered too dangerous or difficult for civilian life." She gestured to Ranger, "But these dogs have skills that are incredibly valuable. They're trained, disciplined, loyal. They understand trauma because they've lived through it. And with the right handlers, they can help veterans with PTSD, anxiety, mobility issues, and more." "So we are starting a program," Tom said, finding his voice, "working with military bases and shelters to identify retired working dogs who need homes, then matching them with veterans who need companions, training both the bigs and the handlers to work together, building partnerships that help both heal." The room erupted in applause. "We've already got our first 3 matches lined up," Kate added, "and funding through the VA and private donations. This is just the beginning." Patricia stood. "I want in. Whatever you need, I'm volunteering." "Same," Marcus said. Luther and James nodded agreement. Within minutes, Tom had a dozen volunteers offering time, expertise, and resources. He looked at Ranger, who was watching the gathering with a patient approval, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Real, genuine hope for the future. The gathering wound down around midnight. People helped clean up, said their goodbyes, and headed home with promises to return next week. Sarah was the last to leave, standing on the porch with her coat buttoned against the cold. "Rob would be proud," she said quietly, "of what you've built here, what you've become. I couldn't have done it without you, without all of you. That's the point, Tom. None of us can do it alone. That's what makes us strong." She drove away, taillights disappearing down the access road. Tom stood on the porch with Ranger looking out at the forest and the mountains beyond. The cabin was warm behind him, filled with the lingering presence of community and connection. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer empty. His phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. "Got a call from Animal Control. Dog found on Highway 12 injured, probably military. Are you available?" Tom looked at Ranger, who was already alert and attentive, ready for the next mission. He texted back, "Send me the location. We're on our way." Inside, Tom grabbed his medical kit and the heavy blanket he kept for emergencies. Ranger followed him to Sarah's truck, which she'd left for him to use until he bought his own. They drove through the Montana night, the stars brilliant overhead and the road empty ahead. Tom thought about Wade Hutchins, about the mission that had brought Ranger to him, about how one act of service had rippled outward, creating connections and purpose that neither of them could have anticipated. Somewhere ahead, another dog needed help. Another veteran four-legged this time who'd given everything in service and now needed someone to return the favor. Tom pressed the accelerator and Ranger shifted in the passenger seat, ready. They had work to do, not because they had to, but because they'd found their purpose in helping others find theirs. In building bridges between isolation and community. In proving that survival wasn't enough, that there was still meaning to be found in service and sacrifice. The highway stretched ahead, dark and endless. Tom Brennan drove toward whatever came next, no longer alone, no longer lost. Just a veteran and his dog answering the call one more time.